Hey guys, so today we're going to go over the rise of Napoleon, which is going to be another leader of France during the French Revolution. And Napoleon's important because he rises to power as an emperor of France. And an emperor, as we're going to see, is pretty much just like a king. So he's going to be pretty important for the test. And we're also going to look at lesson 6 today, which is his fall. And I actually gave you the notes just for lesson 6. So let's take a look at this cheat sheet I gave you first, just so you get an idea of how France was over time. So, before the French Revolution, remember, we had an absolute monarchy in France. And that's when the king had all the power in France. He made all the decisions. Nobody was above him. He always used the divine right, saying that God chose him to rule and no one is above that rule. And the example we see during the French Revolution is King Louis XVI, XVI. And as you remember from the previous lesson with Robespierre, the Jacobins, he got guillotined, he got beheaded, and eventually he died. So during the French Revolution, and especially during the era of the Reign of Terror, we had a republic. And a republic's just pretty much more than one person is making decisions in the government. You really don't have to know too much what a republic is. And remember, the ruler was Robespierre and his Jacobins. And those were the radical or extreme people who wanted to violently kill anyone who went against the French Revolution. But as you learned, you're going to learn in this lesson, what would eventually happen is Robespierre would himself get guillotined. He'd get his head chopped off because people started to be afraid of him, and people thought he was abusing his power, so they actually killed him. So during the reign of Napoleon and after the Reign of Terror, Napoleon comes to power, and the government started as a directory. And a directory is pretty much you had 3 people making all decisions in France, and you had one of those 3 people as a leader. That one of those people, the top leader, was Napoleon. And what he'd eventually do is he'd crown himself Emperor of France. And pretty much, guys, that's just like a king. So think about that. France went from having a revolution to get rid of the king to having another king crowned. And I put a note here. The emperor is similar to a king, but an emperor rules over an empire. So we're going to see in this lesson that Napoleon took over more land than just France. He took over a whole empire. So when you own a country, you can consider yourself a king. But when you own territory or land other than your country, and you make an empire, you're known as an emperor. And again, this ruler is known as Napoleon. So let's talk about his rise to power. So we're going to read the text below and determine how Napoleon rose to power by answering the question. So, towards the end of the Reign of Terror, the people of France felt threatened and scared of Maximilien Robespierre's harsh and bloody leadership. He was executed by guillotine in 1794, and with his death came to the end of the terror. So the Reign of Terror ended because Robespierre was killed. People got tired of him. So who's next to rise in power, people were thinking. So at the end of Robespierre, a new government was created, a directory. And this was a group of 5 men that would rule France. The people believed that a group of 5 men would rule better than a single person. But the problem with the directory, guys, was it was weak and had many problems. And one of the problems was that it used military to maintain order rather than depend on laws. So people didn't really listen to them at all. So they had to use violence, and they had to use their military to scare people into obeying orders. And as we know, when you try to scare people into obeying orders, often it doesn't really work for them. You know, it makes it really difficult for people to want to obey those laws. And there was also widespread corruption. Each man tried to take more power than the others. So I know I mentioned 3 before, but what I didn't write in here, because it's really not too important, what eventually happened was the directory changed to 3 people ruling. And like I said, there's always a top person out of those 3, and the top person was Napoleon. In addition, they also allowed people to vote, but if they didn't like the results of the vote, they throw it away and do what they wanted instead. So guys, what we really have here is something very similar to what people rebelled against during the French Revolution. Remember, King Louis sent his military when the Third Estate or National Assembly tried to make a new government, right? Remember, the Third Estate tried to have a say in voting, but the First and Second Estate didn't really listen to them. So, Napoleon Bonaparte was a military leader who exposed the corruption of the Directory and gained a lot of followers. He launched a coup d'etat, which is a military overthrow of the government, or just an overthrow of the government. And when he took power, he changed France's government yet again, this time replacing the Directory with a consulate. So this is where that three-man rule comes to power. And Napoleon, what would eventually happen, because he was so popular, was that Napoleon eventually crowned himself Emperor of France and took all the power. So now we have an emperor, we have a king. Okay, and Napoleon is the leader of France. He's the one making all the decisions in France. So why was Robespierre eventually kicked out of power and executed? And it says right here, France felt threatened and scared of Maximilien Robespierre's bloody and harsh leadership. There you go. There's the answer right here. So people were afraid. People feared this leader, right? And as a result, they wanted him out of power. Okay? Because they feared him. They feared of speaking up against him. Because remember, if you remember from last lesson, he didn't just kill nobles and people in the upper estates and the king. He actually killed people without evidence or without proof who he thought was going against the revolution. Now, why did Napoleon look to overthrow the Directory? So we just have to talk about the problems of the Directory, right? So the Directory was weak and had many problems, right? So we're going to put that simple. The Directory was weak, okay? And we're going to list some reasons why. So the first reason was it needed military to enforce laws. Laws were not good enough to maintain order. And people don't like being ruled by the military, guys. So people were really annoyed and frustrated that the military was kind of bossing them around to follow order rather than, have the people just follow laws on their own. Also, there was widespread corruption. Each man tried to take more power. So here's your second answer. There's widespread corruption. Each man tried to take more power. So that's the second reason. And guys, people don't like corruption. People don't like the fact people are trying to fight for power instead of helping out the people of France. And then the third reason was if they didn't like the results of a vote, they'd throw it away and do what they wanted instead. So guys, this one's probably the most important, because remember when the French Revolution began, the people of the Third Estate, or the National Assembly, had no say. They couldn't do anything at all, because the First and Second Estate and the king always made the decisions. So they didn't like the idea that they would cast this vote, the freedom to have this vote. They had this freedom to vote, and they would cast it, and then the Directory did what they want anyway. And that was the reason why the Directory was pretty much overthrown, those three reasons. So we could pause the video now and go over, just copy down numbers 1 and 2. And also, keep in mind, guys, that where I'm trying to find this in the paragraph, when I bold the stuff, so when I say bold, so you see these darker words, you see how they're darker than others? That's usually where you can find the answers. And that's just a way to help you out. And notice that everything I pretty much copied was bolded. Now, number 3, do you think people who began the French Revolution will agree with Napoleon's claim as emperor? Why or why not? So this question is open-ended for you guys, so I'm excited to see what you answer for this. But it can go both ways. Some people could say they liked Napoleon because he dealt with the corruption and helped out the people. And people would say no, because Napoleon just became king and they tried to fight against the king. They wanted more freedom of the Third Estate and the people. So you can decide what you want to write for that. It just has to, answer why. So copy 1 and 2, and we can move on. Okay. Now we're going to look at how Napoleon was actually pretty popular despite being the Emperor of France. So we're going to look at why he was so popular. And there's really 3 reasons why. So why was he a hero of France? So Napoleon established the Napoleonic Code in France. The Napoleonic Code was a law code which had Enlightenment principles such as the equality of all citizens before the law and religious toleration. And this code allowed him to create political stability in France. Guys, that's very, very important. Him as a leader, he was able to create political stability with this code. So he was an enlightened despot, if you remember that vocabulary word. He was the one who, pushed these Enlightenment ideas and gave citizens, the right to practice any religion they want, and he made citizens equal amongst the law. He also passed many educational reforms. And one of these was the creation of public schools and École Polytechnique, which is a public university. So it's like a college today, guys. And pretty much what Napoleon did was he placed students in barracks, in uniform, and under strict military discipline. But despite the strict military influence, the schools continued to produce the best engineers and scientists in Europe. So Napoleon militarized the school system. He made, if you want to think of it, he pretty much made these students into the military. They followed military code. But despite that, he really helped out these students because the public schools and the universities were amongst the best in Europe at the time. And, he really improved education. Napoleon also improved the economy of France. He found the Bank of France, which helped aid commerce. And commerce is just business, guys. So when you hear the word commerce, it's just people's private businesses. He also built roads and canals to help improve trade and encourage new industry, which created new businesses. So, how is Napoleon seen as a hero of France? So you guys have a lot, and you guys got to pick one from each paragraph. So we have the Napoleonic Code, which gave Enlightenment ideals such as equal citizens under the law and religious tolerance. So, he gave people freedoms in France. 2, he had educational reforms, and he established public school systems and universities which produced the best scientists and engineers. Okay. So guys, again, he just improved the education. That's all you really have to know. He improved the education. I just gave you the example. He helped improve public school systems and universities and produce the best scientists and engineers in Europe. Also, what did he do? He improved the economy. Okay? And how did he do this? Let's take a look. He established the Bank of France, which helped commerce, or in other words, guys, commerce is, people's businesses. So this bank helped people build their own businesses. He built roads and canals, which improved trade. Okay, and encouraged new industry, which gave jobs to the people of France. Okay, So this is just three ways for number four that, he was a hero of France. People loved Napoleon. So take some time and copy that down. Okay, great. So now we're going to look at, so he was a hero of France. People really liked him in France. But now what we're going to look at is how he was an enemy of Europe. So remember, France is the country. You can look at this map right here. It's a country, okay? Europe is the continent. So this is all of Europe. France was the only country in Europe at the time. So why was he an enemy of Europe? So let's just take a look at the map before we get to any questions, okay? So France, or actually better yet, let's look at the question first. Explain the change in France's territorial control according to the map from 1799 to 1812. Remember, guys, with map reading, always look at the keys. So we have France. This was just France in 1799, okay? And now we look at the map, Napoleon's additions to France by 1812. So he added territory by taking it over and conquering using his military. And that's when his empire really became an empire, because empire expands beyond the country itself. So he started taking territories. And then he took over more states in Europe. In this case, so there wasn't really an Italy at this point, or Germany. So they were just known as states. But if you can see the pink, he took over the country of Spain, modern day Spain. He took over parts of modern day Italy, parts of Germany. So he's really expanding his empire. And then he made some allies like Prussia, Austria, Norway. So this is his empire right here. He really expanded his territory. And this is what really became an empire. And France for a while was very strong. So explain the change. Napoleon expanded France's territory and created an empire, just like that. Perfect. So that's the answer for number 5. Napoleon expanded France's territory and created an empire. So he made it bigger. Okay, now let's do a primary source read. So ready? Napoleon is the enemy of Europe. The evil emperor of France conquered the lands of Europe around France. He took over many areas in Europe, such as Spain and parts of Italy, Germany, and Belgium. His main goal is to have complete domination of Europe, so no one could declare war on France or bring the country to a period of instability. We must fight back at this tyrant, not let him conquer Britain. So why does the author believe Napoleon's evil? So he conquered or took over lands of Europe through warfare. Okay? That's really the answer here. And you can just use anything from the text if you want. You can just put in the text simply using this, just make a quote. Look at this. This is just using evidence from the text, right? Put a quote. So a good answer was, in the text, comma, the author states he took over many areas in Europe, such as Spain, parts of Italy, Germany, and Belgium. And there's your answer for number 6. So you're done with that. Remember, he was seen as an enemy because he took over lands. So the question is, guys, this is going on lesson 6 now. What is Europe going to do? What's going to happen? So now the aim here is, how did the fall of Napoleon lead to the conquest of Vienna? So eventually what would happen, guys, is all these countries, let's take a look at the map again. All these countries, like Britain, eventually Prussia, Russia, and eventually Austria, would all come together and try to fight Napoleon back because they didn't want to be conquered by France. So the fall of Napoleon. The European powers such as Britain were threatened by Napoleon's conquering or taking over Europe. But what would eventually happen, guys, is Napoleon would lose two important battles, which caused his empire to fall. Okay? So the first one is Napoleon's invasion of Russia. So Napoleon he made a bad move invading Russia because in 1812 he did not predict how harsh the Russian winter would be because the winters in Russia are extremely harsh. It's very cold and it causes a lot of problems for Napoleon's army. And as a result, his soldiers froze and starved to death due to not being able to grow food. So he lost a lot of men at this invasion. This is a major battle he lost. And then the second one was the Battle of Waterloo. This is the final battle that really caused Napoleon to lose power of France. So the Battle of Waterloo, which is in France, I'll just show you. See right here, it says Waterloo. Circling, it's in France, northern France. So Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia formed an alliance. An alliance, guys, is a political and military friendship. So they became friends, these four countries, okay? And they all fought against Napoleon because they didn't want him to expand anymore. They didn't want him to fight anymore. So the alliance defeated Napoleon's forces, killing 33,000 of his soldiers. Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815. He gave up his power of France and was exiled and banished to a remote island where he died. So this was the fall of Napoleon. This emperor who was once powerful, once great, and took over a lot of Europe is now defeated. So where does Europe go from here? Europe's a mess, guys. There were so many wars. The French Revolution caused an issue. So where do we go from here? And this is where the Congress of Vienna comes. And guys, this is pretty important. So as you see here, you have all the leaders of Europe really redrawing the map of Europe right here. And what was the goal here? So why have the Congress of Vienna? So Europe was in a mess after the rise of Napoleon and the French Revolution. So Europe's leaders from each country met at the Congress of Vienna, which is in Austria, to discuss the future of Europe. And there's really two goals you guys really need to know with this. So these European powers met, right? And they got together and they wanted two things pretty much. They wanted to redraw the map to make sure each country was equal in size and power to restore peace as it was before the French Revolution. And guys, the goal here was to, really important, was to prevent another emperor like Napoleon from rising to power and taking over Europe. That was the whole goal here. They wanted to make each country equal in power, so no country would take over another one. And also, guys, this is very, very important. This is the exact answer on your test, actually. The only question we have for the Congress of Vienna is your answer. They look to restore the old regimes to power. And what they mean by the old regimes is the king's areas taken over by Napoleon. So they look to put back a king in the area around Italy. They look to put a king back in Austria, in Prussia, because they wanted things just to go back before the French Revolution. They wanted to rewind the clock and place everything back before Europe was a mess. They wanted everything to be peaceful and normal again. And guys, the whole main goal here, I'm just going to put this in big letters, was peace. They wanted peace. That's the whole idea. That's why they're redrawing the map to make each country equal, and that is why they're trying to restore the kings of these areas, so the kings make peace themselves. All right, I hope this helps, guys.